Hello everyone, DJ here, and welcome back to Thomas Characters Explained, the show where we go over the history and show presence of various different Thomas and Friends characters. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about a character that has been suggested many times by many different people, and I'm pretty confident in assuming that he is many fans' favorite. That's right, this week we are talking about Luke, the little green narrow gauge engine who works at the Blue Mountain Quarry and frequents many parts of the Skarloey Railway, as well as Ulfstead Castle. Luke may be a much later addition to the narrow gauge cast of characters, but there is a lot to him. And out of all of the new characters from the Nitrogen era, he was definitely the one who warranted a video the most. So without further ado, let's talk about everything Luke, from his personality, to his appearances, to his basis, and so much more. Let's get into it, shall we? Luke is a green narrow gauge engine who works up at the Blue Mountain Quarry. First introduced in the 2012 Thomas and Friends film Blue Mountain Mystery, his introduction story quickly became one of the most beloved by fans of the CGI era. Long before the events of the film, Luke came from Ireland, presumably, to work on Sodor, which was always his dream. He was loaded onto a ship with a yellow engine that spoke a different language, and when he arrived to Sodor, he begged to have the men unload him onto the dock first. That was when disaster struck. Unknown to Luke or the workmen, the yellow engine's chains had snapped on the voyage, meaning he was not fully secured to the deck of the ship. And when Luke was lifted off the ship, he, by no fault of his own, bumped into the yellow engine, who then fell into the sea. Blaming himself for the accident and fearing he would be sent away from Sodor for causing the yellow engine to be presumably scrapped, Luke hid himself away at the Blue Mountain Quarry with the help of the narrow gauge engines. Here, he hid successfully for many years until Thomas arrived. As the events of Blue Mountain Mystery unfolded, Thomas found himself working in Paxton's place at the Blue Mountain Quarry after Blondin Bridge collapsed and covered Paxton in rubble. Here, Thomas first encountered Luke, and the narrow gauge engines decided to trust Thomas and reveal only that Luke had done something very bad, and he was fearing being sent away from Sodor. Thomas felt sorry for Luke, and on top of getting to know him, took it upon himself to solve the mystery of what happened to the yellow engine, which eventually turned out to be Victor, who wasn't scrapped at all, just simply repainted. Victor explained the chains had snapped, and with the language barrier, he was unable to warn anyone and acknowledged that it was not Luke's fault. With this newfound information, Thomas raced back to the Blue Mountain Quarry. However, the narrow gauge engines, already fearful and selectively trusting due to the danger presented to Luke, wouldn't hear Thomas out fully when he said he talked to Victor, all of them puffing away angrily. Thomas, with Owen's help, attempted to follow Luke along narrow gauge rails, and when he almost fell off a cliff, Luke saved him and reconciled their friendship. Victor arrived at the Blue Mountain Quarry with Paxton and the Fat Controller and Mr. Percival, leading to Luke's name finally being cleared and him being embraced as both a member of the Skarloey and Sodor families. Luke then went on to become a pretty frequent recurring character, despite no appearances in Season 16, oddly, across Seasons 17 to 21 once the Brenner era kicked into full swing. Here, he starred in episodes like Luke's New Friend, where he befriended a baby deer and tried to have it live at the quarry, but eventually realized it was for the best for the deer to be at Ulfstead within nature. He also at this point developed a pretty interesting dynamic with Millie, another CGI-exclusive narrow gauge character, in the Season 17 episode The Switch, where the two switch duties for the day and learn a little bit about themselves, each other, and their respective jobs. In Season 18's Duncan the Humbug, Luke was helped up an icy slope by Duncan at Christmas time, and in Season 21, he had his final non-cameo role in Runaway Engine, where he appears at the Blue Mountain Quarry helping Millie get to the Rock Crusher. He would also, of course, as I alluded to earlier, cameo in several episodes, including Saving Time, The Missing Breakdown Train, The Case of the Puzzling Parts, Diesel Do Right, Steam Team to the Rescue, and Nia and the Unfriendly Elephant. Oh, and I totally forgot to mention, I don't know how, that Luke also made an appearance in the 2013 Thomas and Friends film, King of the Railway, appearing at the Blue Mountain Quarry when Steven goes there trying to figure out what his new job on the island is. Not a super exciting appearance or anything, but a fun one and a nice little continuity bit a year following Blue Mountain Mystery. And also quite nice considering the fact that we hadn't seen Luke in a year, as he did not appear in Season 16 for some reason. So kind of an interesting thing there, and I figured I should probably mention it before we close out this segment. Luke is probably one of the most developed new characters in Thomas since Hero, and I do not say that lightly. At least at the time when he was introduced, he was the most developed engine since Hero. He goes through a huge arc of learning to trust, having that trust broken, but still being able to do the right thing in the end in spite of that. Luke also had probably one of the most wholesome arcs in Thomas, living for so long in fear of something he didn't do, only to be proven innocent by Thomas and given a second shot at life. The wiki describes him as follows in terms of his personality, and honestly, it sums it up pretty nicely. Like many engines, there are times where he may want to run away and be left alone, and he may not be quick to stick up for himself either, but when there is someone in need, Luke is passionate about showing how much he values his friends and will bravely heave into action without a second thought. Now that we have a pretty good idea of who Luke is, I think it's time we dive into some history and talk about his basis. Before I start this segment, I just wanted to say that details on Luke's basis are surprisingly hard to find, and any account of its history are often poorly detailed, so take what I say here with a pinch of salt, and if you know something that I don't, please let me know in the comments. Luke is based on a Kerr-Stewart Wren class, a class of 040 saddle tank engines built by Kerr-Stewart, as well as the Hunslet Engine Company. Specifically, Luke is based on number 114, Peter Pan, built in 1922, with the works number 4256. The engine's technical specs are available but limited. The engine had a tractive effort of 1,701 pounds, weighed 4.25 tons, cylinders measuring 6 inches by 9 inches, and Hackworth valve gear. The Wrens first saw production by Kerr-Stewart in 1905, with the last ones built in 1941. 162 in total were built by Kerr-Stewart themselves, and the other 5 were built by Hunslet Works, bringing the grand total to 167 engines. These engines would see work all over the world and were intended to be industrial and/or contracting engines. Due to the popularity of the Wren, its design has been used in replicas by many narrow-gauge and miniature-gauge railways, such as the engine Thomas Wicksteed, built in 2010 for the Kew Bridge Steam Museum. There was also quite a bit of variety and individuality between the engines, which is interesting for a mass-produced class like the Wrens. Some had different cabs, some had side skirting, and at least one reproduction built in 1998 had a tender, something I found interesting. All of the Wrens were eventually withdrawn, but some, including Luke's base as Peter Pan, are preserved. It should also be noted that Peter Sam is also a Kerr-Stewart build, a member of their Tattoo class, making him and Luke cousins, although not the same gauge initially speaking. Peter Pan was built initially to be used as a construction engine on a project in Essex for R.H. Neal & Co. for use by Muirhead and MacDonald Wilson & Co. on the South End Arterial Roadway. Another project, a roadway known as the Paracombe Deviation, began in 1925. This roadway was near the Linton and Barnstaple Railway, and a 2-foot gauge line was laid from the quarry at Beacon Down across the Linton and Barnstaple and then down to the beginning of the deviation, which opened in 1927. The surveyor of the project, Mr. R.M. Stone, had bought Kerr-Stewart Wrens to help with the construction, and now, in 1929, was wanting to improve the output of roadstone from the quarry of Wilmanstone. Thus, he purchased 2 more of the Wrens from the locomotive dealer Thomas W. Ward. These engines would later become number 113 Pixie and number 114 Peter Pan. During its time on this project, the engine was owned by the Devon County Council. Sometime around 1950, Peter Pan was moved to Beacon Down to assist the Ruston and Hornsby diesel who worked there but needed repair work done. However, by 1951, the engine was left on a siding, and Peter Pan was eventually purchased for preservation in 1959 and is now owned and based out of the Lytton Buzzard Narrow Gauge Railway. Peter Pan, like many preserved engines, has been a guest at many different heritage railways, including the Beamish Museum, and far more interestingly, the Stoomcentrum Maldegem in Belgium for a few of its steam festivals. Quite the history for this little engine. And so for right now, let's get into my thoughts on Luke. Luke is probably one of my favorite CGI characters simply because there is so much to him. Not only is he insanely likable, but his mere existence and story boosted up other characters too, like Victor, who gained an entirely new and awesome backstory, as well as Paxton, who throughout the film learned to go with his gut and not listen to Diesel in the midst of the Luke conflict. Luke is also a character who is very easy to root for, and that was a welcome change in a time when every new character either didn't have story/personality, or they were so annoying that you would never root for them even if they did have a good story. I also think it's interesting that Luke is Irish, only because he is directly based off of an engine, that being Peter Pan, who never directly worked in Ireland, instead spending most of its working non-preserved life in the southwest of England. So in my opinion, it is a little up for debate what Luke's history prior to Sodor was. I think it could either be an alternative history for Peter Pan, where for part of its life it worked in Ireland, or maybe after being preserved in 1959, he gained the name Luke and worked in Ireland for a bit before coming to Sodor. I think it could also be entirely possible that, similar to Steven with his rocket nameplate, Luke could have worn the name Peter Pan but gone by Luke, and then had his name painted on him at some other point. To be honest though, that's about as far as my headcanon goes for Luke, and in terms of my thoughts, all you really need to know is that I think he is really great. Alrighty, here we have the 2012 Take and Play Luke, and I'm just gonna say it, this has to be one of, if not the best Take and Play models ever. I mean, look at the accuracy of this thing. Between the mold, the proportions, and the paint job, as well as that killer face, this is one stellar model. Just to compare, I thought it would be interesting to place an Adventures Luke next to the Take and Play one, and the difference is like night and day. Whereas the Adventures one is extremely squashed, and the proportions are all out of whack, the Take and Play one is extremely accurate, and honestly, I don't think it's too far off from what a company like, say, Bachmann would do with their HON 30 representation of Luke. This was one of my favorite models as a kid, and it definitely is today as well. Extremely solid. I'm giving Luke, I think, my first 10 out of 10. So good on you there, Luke. Alrighty folks, that concludes this episode of Thomas Characters Explained. I hope you all enjoyed. It's funny, I never really understood the hype people had around narrow gauge engines until I started researching a few of them for this series, and I gotta say, you guys were so right. They are really something. Thank you for watching, guys. If you have any suggestions for future characters, please leave them in the comments, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, guys!